Case 1. Krystall Whipple. Clark County District Court, Las Vegas, Nevada. Date of incident: December 29, 2018. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a strip mall parking lot on a Saturday afternoon in late December. Families are finishing their holiday errands. Shop windows still carry the last of their tinsel. And in a modest nail salon tucked between a laundromat and a phone repair shop on Flamingo Road, a woman named Gwen was doing what she had done nearly every day for over a decade: working. Gwen, whom friends and regular customers affectionately called Annie, had built a life in Las Vegas defined by relentless effort. Originally from Vietnam, she had come to the United States chasing the kind of opportunity that so many immigrants search for: a chance to build something lasting for the people she loved. She worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, managing Krystall Nails and Spa with a discipline that colleagues would later describe as almost military in its consistency. She rarely took a day off. Her daughter would later tell a courtroom that the rare occasions the family gathered together felt like small miracles, snatched from an otherwise endless work schedule. On the afternoon of December 29, 2018, a young woman walked into the salon for a routine manicure. She would later be identified as 21-year-old Krystall Whipple. There was nothing, on the surface, to distinguish this appointment from the hundreds of others Gwen handled that month. Whipple sat, received her service, and when it came time to settle the $35 bill, she reached for a credit card. The transaction failed. It failed again. According to witnesses, Whipple offered a simple explanation: she would go out to her car and grab cash instead. It is the kind of moment that plays out in small businesses every single day, all across the country. A card declines, a customer steps outside, and 9 times out of 10, they return, embarrassed, with the correct payment in hand. Gwen had likely seen this exact scenario unfold dozens of times over the years. There was no reason, in that moment, to expect anything different. But Whipple did not return with cash. Instead, storefront surveillance cameras captured her climbing into a vehicle, one that investigators would later determine had been stolen, and beginning to pull away without paying. Gwen and her boyfriend, alarmed at watching a customer simply drive off after receiving a service, moved instinctively to stop her. It is a decision that, in hindsight, carries an unbearable weight. A decision made not out of recklessness, but out of a basic sense of fairness, a belief that people should be held accountable for what they owe. What happened next was captured in full on the salon's exterior camera, footage that would later be released to the public and would circulate nationally within days. As Gwen and her boyfriend approached the vehicle, Whipple accelerated. Gwen was struck by the car and dragged for approximately 50 feet across the pavement of the parking lot before the vehicle sped off into traffic, leaving her with catastrophic injuries from which she would not survive. For the responding officers of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, the scene was almost incomprehensibly senseless. Homicide Lieutenant Ray Spencer, who oversaw the initial investigation, would later describe his own disbelief that a dispute over such a small amount of money could end an innocent woman's life. In the days that followed, investigators worked to identify the driver, eventually releasing the surveillance footage to the public along with an urgent appeal for information. The video, showing the final horrifying seconds of the encounter, ignited immediate public outrage across Las Vegas and, soon after, across the country as national outlets picked up the story. Whipple, meanwhile, had vanished. She did not return home. She did not turn herself in. For days, her whereabouts were unknown, and law enforcement mobilized a search that extended well beyond Nevada's borders. It was, in every sense, a manhunt, one that would eventually draw in an FBI task force working in coordination with local police. Even Whipple's own mother, according to reporting at the time, came forward to assist investigators in locating her daughter, a detail that speaks to the complicated, painful position families are sometimes placed in when someone they love is accused of something unthinkable. The break in the case came roughly 2 weeks after Nguyen's death, when the FBI task force located Whipple in Glendale, Arizona. She was taken into custody without incident, ending the search that had gripped the Las Vegas Valley through the first weeks of the new year. Back in Nevada, prosecutors moved forward with a case built substantial around the salon's own surveillance footage, witness testimony, and the physical evidence collected at the scene. Whipple initially faced an array of serious charges, including burglary, robbery, and possession of a stolen vehicle, layered on top of the central charge stemming from Nguyen's death. Rather than proceed to a full trial, one that would have forced Nguyen's family to relive the footage and the details of that afternoon in open court, Whipple ultimately entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. The sentencing hearing, held in early 2021, brought Nguyen's family before the court to describe, in their own words, what had been taken from them. Her daughter spoke of a mother who worked tirelessly, whose rare moments of rest were treasured precisely because they were so scarce, and whose absence had left a permanent, aching gap in their lives. District Judge Tiara Jones, addressing the courtroom directly, called the loss of Nguyen's life nothing short of a tragedy, emphasizing that a woman had lost her life simply trying to earn an honest living and provide a service to a customer. Whipple, then 23, offered no statement of her own. She was sentenced to a term of 10 to 25 years in Nevada State Prison. In the years since, Nguyen's story has become something larger than a single, isolated tragedy. Small business advocates and members of the local Vietnamese American community in Las Vegas have pointed to her case as emblematic of a broader vulnerability faced by service workers, people who spend their days in direct, often unmonitored contact with strangers, trusting that basic transactions will be honored in good faith. Nguyen's death, so disproportionate to its origin, has prompted renewed conversations in the Valley about safety protocols for small business owners and the invisible risks embedded in the most mundane parts of daily commerce. What remains, ultimately, is the memory of a woman who spent her life in quiet, determined service to her family, a woman whose name deserves to be remembered not for the manner of her death, but for the decades of labor, sacrifice, and love that defined the life that came before it. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 2, Margaret Rudin. Clark County District Court, Las Vegas, Nevada. December 18, 1994. Few names in Nevada's criminal history carry the same enduring mystique as Margaret Rudin, a woman whose case would come to be known across the country simply as the story of the Black Widow of Las Vegas. Ronald Rudin was, by every account from those who knew him, a man of rigid habit. A prominent real estate investor who had built his fortune in the desert boomtown of Las Vegas. He was known for his punctuality, his discipline, and a business routine so consistent that friends and colleagues could practically set their watches by it. So when he failed to appear for a string of appointments in the days leading up to Christmas of 1994, those around him grew concerned almost immediately. This was not a man who simply disappeared. His wife, Margaret, offered investigators an explanation. Ronald had gone to meet someone about a potential investment and had not returned. It was a plausible enough story on its face, and for a brief window of time, it held. But as days turned into weeks with no sign of him, unease turned into alarm, and alarm turned into a formal investigation. The truth, when it surfaced, was devastating. Weeks after his disappearance, Ronald Rudin's burned remains were discovered in a remote stretch of desert near Lake Mead. A man known for his precision and predictability had met an end that was anything but ordinary, and almost immediately, investigators' attention turned toward the person closest to him, his wife. Margaret's life, investigators soon learned, was more complicated than her calm demeanor suggested. She had been married multiple times before meeting Ronald, and their marriage had reportedly grown strained in its final years, weighed down by financial disagreements and rumors of infidelity on both sides. To prosecutors building a case, the picture that emerged was one of a marriage in crisis, ended not by divorce, but by something far more permanent. In 1997, Margaret was formally indicted in connection with her husband's death. Rather than face those charges in a Nevada courtroom, she disappeared. What followed was one of the more remarkable fugitive pursuits in the state's history. Margaret adopted disguises, assumed false identities, and moved quietly across the country for nearly 2 years, evading a nationwide search. Her capture finally came in 1999, when investigators tracked her down in Massachusetts. She was extradited back to Nevada to face trial. The trial itself became a national media event. Journalists and true crime audiences across the country followed the proceedings closely, drawn in by the almost cinematic details of the case. The vanished husband, the burned remains in the desert, the wife who had lived for years under assumed names. It was during this period that the nickname Black Widow of Las Vegas took hold in press coverage, a label that would follow Margaret for the rest of her life regardless of what came next legally. In the year 2001, a Clark County jury reached its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Margaret was sentenced to life in prison. For the next 20 years, she remained behind bars, consistently maintaining her innocence and pursuing a long, difficult series of appeals through both state and federal courts. Legal experts who followed the case over the decades often pointed to persistent questions about the adequacy of her original defense, questions that would eventually prove central to everything that followed. Margaret was granted parole in January of 2020, walking out of Nevada's Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center at 76 years old, telling reporters at the time that she remained hopeful her conviction would someday be overturned entirely. She would not have to wait long. In May of 2022, a federal judge issued a sweeping ruling. Margaret's constitutional right to effective legal counsel had been violated at her original trial. The judge's language was unambiguous, describing her original defense as having fallen so far short of basic professional standards that it undermined confidence in the outcome of the entire trial. With that ruling, Margaret's 21-year-old conviction was formally vacated. The story did not end there. For 2 more years, the question of whether Nevada would seek to retry Margaret hung unresolved. Finally, in December of 2024, Clark County prosecutors made their decision. The charges against her would be dismissed entirely. The legal effect, as her attorney stated plainly outside the courthouse that day, was that Margaret has never been lawfully convicted of any crime and cannot be prosecuted again for Ronald's death. It is important to note, in the interest of fairness to everyone involved, that prosecutors have been careful to clarify what this outcome does and does not mean. The dismissal was not a declaration of Margaret's innocence. No court has ever made such a finding. Rather, it was an acknowledgement that the legal process which convicted her in 2001 was fundamentally compromised. Margaret herself has said publicly that she does not know who was responsible for her husband's death, and has spent the years since her release advocating for reforms aimed at protecting other defendants from the kind of inadequate representation she says defined her original trial. What remains, more than 3 decades after Ronald Rudin's disappearance, is a case suspended between 2 irreconcilable truths. A jury once found Margaret guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and a federal court later found that verdict too flawed to stand. Somewhere in that unresolved space lies the still unanswered question of what truly happened to Ronald Rudin in the final hours of his life, a question that, to this day, remains locked away with him in the Nevada desert. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 3. Brenda Stokes Wilson. Clark County District Court, Las Vegas, Nevada. December 21, 2012. Some cases leave behind more questions than answers. This is one of them. A case in which even the judge who oversaw its resolution would later admit that no one, not the prosecution, not the defense, not the family left grieving, ever fully understood the reason behind it. 10-year-old Jade Morris was, by every description offered of her, a quiet, gentle child. She attended school regularly, was well-behaved, and was known to neighbors as a sweet, unassuming little girl. Her father, Philip Morris, had been in a relationship for several years with a woman named Brenda Stokes Wilson, a fellow casino worker who had, by all outward appearances, built a warm and familiar bond with Jade over time. She was, in the eyes of those around the family, simply part of the fabric of Jade's life, someone who picked her up, spent time with her, and seemed to care for her. On the afternoon of December 21, 2012, Wilson arrived at the home of Jade's mother, Tejuana Reeves, with a simple, festive plan. She would take Jade Christmas shopping. It was the kind of errand that had likely played out between them many times before. Reeves said goodbye to her daughter that afternoon with no reason for concern. Wilson told her she would have Jade back by 9 that evening. 9 o'clock came and went. Reeves began calling Wilson's phone, first every hour, then more frequently, as the night wore on without any word. By morning, with still no answer and no sign of her daughter, Reeves had exhausted every explanation she could think of. She began contacting hospitals. She went to the police station. She filed a missing persons report, carrying with her the last image she had of Jade, dressed for a shopping trip, in a blue My Little Pony t-shirt and a brown coat, completely unaware that anything was wrong. That same night, in a separate incident that would later prove to be connected, Wilson appeared at a Las Vegas casino where she had once worked and approached a blackjack table. There, she attacked a former coworker, a dealer named Joyce Roan, cutting her face during a sudden and unprovoked confrontation. Wilson believed, without any apparent evidence, that Roan had become romantically involved with Philip Morris. Roan survived the attack, but the reason behind it, a delusional certainty rooted in jealousy, would later become central to understanding what had happened to Jade earlier that same evening. It would take investigators several agonizing days to connect these two incidents, and even longer to locate Jade. Her body was ultimately discovered in a stretch of undeveloped desert land in North Las Vegas, found by a passerby out walking a dog. The discovery brought a devastating and final answer to the question that had haunted her mother since the previous evening, and it opened an investigation into a level of violence that left even experienced detectives struggling to make sense of what they were looking at. A medical examiner would later testify that Jade had suffered extensive sharp force injuries so severe that she was likely rendered unconscious within minutes, injuries that shocked investigators accustomed to processing difficult scenes. As the case developed, prosecutors and reporters alike began digging into Wilson's past, uncovering a troubling incident from years earlier in her hometown in Mississippi, where she had once faced allegations of a violent attack against a former partner. Those charges had ultimately been dropped after the alleged victim declined to testify, and no conviction had ever resulted, but the pattern it suggested, of sudden and extreme reactions to perceived betrayal, cast a long shadow over the case prosecutors were now building against her. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Wilson's legal team negotiated an agreement with prosecutors. In January of 2016, she entered guilty pleas to first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, attempted murder, burglary, and mayhem, all with deadly weapon enhancements attached. Prosecutors later explained their reasoning for accepting the plea rather than pursuing a capital case. Given Wilson's age, they believed she was more likely to die of natural causes than to ever face an actual execution, given the length of Nevada's appellate process. As one prosecutor put it plainly in court, the additional decades attached to her sentence on the remaining charges reflected just how horrific the crime had been. She simply did not have enough years of life left to satisfy them all. At her sentencing in the spring of 2016, Jade's family addressed the court directly. Her mother described a daughter who had done nothing in her short life to deserve what was taken from her. Other relatives spoke through tears, describing Jade as more than a statistic, a real little girl, with a personality, with a future that had been permanently erased. Wilson attempted to make a statement of her own near the end of the hearing, but the judge declined to allow it, ruling that the family deserved to have the final word after everything they had endured. Wilson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 51 years on the remaining counts. What has never been fully answered, even after the case reached its legal conclusion, is why investigators, prosecutors, and even members of Wilson's own defense team have publicly acknowledged that no clear, rational motive was ever established for why a woman with what appeared to be a caring relationship with a child would take her life over an unfounded suspicion involving the child's father. It is a question that continues to unsettle those who followed the case closely, and one that speaks to a broader, painful truth in cases involving jealousy-driven violence, that the reasoning behind them rarely, if ever, makes sense to anyone standing outside of it. Jade's case has since become a point of reference for child advocacy organizations across Nevada, who point to it as a reminder of how critical it is for parents and guardians to remain vigilant even in relationships that appear stable and loving on the surface. Organizations such as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children continue to offer resources and guidance for families navigating custody arrangements, informal caregiving relationships, and the warning signs that can sometimes precede violence. Resources that Jade's own family has said they wish had been more widely known and accessible in the years before her death. Jade Morris would be a young woman today, had her life not been cut short in the back of a desert lot on a December evening meant for holiday shopping. Her memory endures not in the details of how she died, but in the insistence of those who loved her that she be remembered simply as a sweet, ordinary little girl who deserved so much more than the world gave her. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 4. Michelle Paet. December 1st, 2010. Clark County, Nevada. Nathan Paet was an active-duty United States Air Force Staff Sergeant, stationed in the Las Vegas area near Nellis Air Force Base, a sprawling installation that has anchored the city's military community for generations. He had built a career around service, the kind of steady commitment that comes with deployments, training rotations, and the quiet understanding among military families that risk is part of the job. What no one expects is that the greatest danger to a service member might be waiting inside their own marriage. On this December night, Sergeant Paet was ambushed just outside his own home. It was not a random act of violence, and it was not connected to his military service in any operational sense. Investigators determined that his wife, Michelle Paet, had coordinated the attack in advance, working with a co-defendant to carry it out. The motive, prosecutors said, came down to money, specifically a $650,000 military life insurance policy tied to her husband's service, a benefit designed to protect families in the event of a service member's death in the line of duty, not to be exploited as the payout for a plot carried out by the person closest to him. The betrayal at the center of this case struck a particular nerve across the Las Vegas military community. Nellis Air Force Base is home to thousands of active-duty personnel and their families, many of whom rely on the same kinds of life insurance benefits that made Sergeant Paet's death so profitable for the person responsible for it. Military spouses in the area later described the case as a gut punch precisely because it inverted every assumption about where danger comes from. Service members train for combat, for deployment risk, for the dangers of the job itself. They do not train for the possibility that the person waiting for them at home might be planning their end for a payout. Investigators built their case around financial records that showed the insurance policy, communications tied to the co-defendant, and evidence establishing that the ambush had been planned rather than spontaneous. Facing that evidence, Michelle Paet ultimately entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder rather than proceed to trial. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected both the calculated nature of the crime and the fact that it targeted someone actively serving his country. For fellow airmen and the surrounding military community, the case closed with a conviction, but it left behind a harder question that advocates for military families have continued to raise ever since. How does a system built to protect service members' loved ones guard against exploitation by those same loved ones? Financial abuse and coercive control inside a marriage can be nearly invisible from the outside, especially in a community where deployments and long separations are considered normal, and where a spouse's private financial dealings are rarely scrutinized until it is far too late. Advocates who work with military families note that financial coercion and hidden financial abuse can be difficult to detect from the outside, even among couples who appear stable to friends, neighbors, and fellow service members. Organizations like Military OneSource offer free, confidential support for service members and their families navigating relationship distress, financial concerns, or safety planning. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another documentary like this one. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. After careful review, we could not verify the details of Case 5. Because Cold Case Hour is committed to bringing you only verified and reliable information, We have decided not to include this case in today's documentary. Let's move to Case 6. Case 6. Rita Cologne. September 3, 2017. Clark County, Nevada. Not every case on this list ends the way viewers might expect a true crime story to end, and Rita Cologne's is the clearest example of that on this entire list. Hers is a case defined less by a verdict than by years of legal uncertainty, competency hearings, and a criminal justice system working through exactly how to handle a defendant whose mental fitness for trial was repeatedly called into question. Rita Cologne was in a relationship with Leroy Pelton, a retired university professor. At the time, he was found stabbed to death. Rather than remain in Nevada to face investigators, Cologne left the country, eventually surfacing in Peru. It would take roughly 2 years and a formal extradition process, involving coordination between Nevada authorities, federal agencies, and Peruvian officials, before she was returned to Las Vegas to face charges connected to Pelton's death. This is where the case departs sharply from almost every other one covered so far. Rita Cologne has never been convicted of first-degree murder in connection with Pelton's death. Early in the legal proceedings, a judge found her mentally incompetent to stand trial, a determination that sent the entire case into an extended holding pattern rather than toward a courtroom resolution. Competency findings like this are not uncommon in the justice system, but they are widely misunderstood by the public, in part because they don't resolve guilt or innocence one way or the other. They simply establish that a defendant cannot, at that point in time, meaningfully participate in their own defense, which the law requires before a trial can proceed. Cologne's legal situation grew more complicated still because of a second, separate case tied to the earlier death of her ex-husband years prior. That case moved through Clark County courts on its own track, entirely apart from the Pelton matter. In July of 2025, a Clark County judge dismissed the murder charges in that related case, a significant legal development, but one that applies specifically to the case involving her ex-husband, not to the ongoing matter involving Pelton. As of this recording, Rita Cologne's legal status regarding Pelton's death remains unresolved in the way most viewers might expect a case like this to conclude. There has been no conviction. Her competency and legal status have continued to be evaluated by the courts, and the case remains open in a way that resists the tidy conclusion audiences often look for in true crime coverage. We want to be especially clear and fair here, because it matters. Because there has been no conviction in the matter involving Leroy Pelton, Rita Cologne must be treated as an accused person in that case, not a convicted one. This case should be understood as ongoing and legally unsettled, not closed, and nothing in this documentary should be taken as a determination of guilt. Cases like this one highlight just how complicated the intersection of mental health and criminal law can be. Competency hearings exist to protect a fundamental right, the right of a defendant to understand the proceedings against them and meaningfully participate in their own defense. When that right comes into question, the legal process can stretch for years, leaving victims' families and the public alike without the resolution they're often hoping for. If you're a family member navigating a loved one's mental health crisis intersecting with the legal system, NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, operates a helpline that can walk you through your options and connect you with local resources. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another documentary like this one. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 7. Offender, Danielle Slaughter. Date of crime, March 8, 2012. Court, Clark County, Nevada. Some cases in Nevada's criminal history aren't remembered for how shocking the crime scene was. They're remembered for how impossible the question at the center of them turned out to be. Case 7 is one of those. It is, without question, the most legally complicated case on this list, and it is the one that forced juries, judges, and medical experts to sit with a question that doesn't have a clean answer. What happens when the person responsible for a tragedy may not have been in control of their own mind when it happened? To understand this case, you have to start long before March 8, 2012. Danielle Slaughter was, by most accounts from people who knew her, an ordinary mother living in the Las Vegas Valley. She had a 6-year-old daughter. There was no criminal record of note, no pattern of violence, Nothing in her history that would have placed her on any investigator's radar. That's part of what made this case so disorienting for the community when it became public. This wasn't a story about a person with a long trail of warning signs. This was a story about how quickly things can change when the brain itself is compromised by forces outside of a person's conscious control. In the months leading up to the crime, Slaughter had been prescribed a sedative hypnotic sleep medication, a class of drug that is extremely common, prescribed to millions of Americans every year for insomnia. What is less commonly discussed, and what became central to this case, is that this class of medication carries documented, FDA-acknowledged warnings about rare but serious side effects. In a small percentage of patients, these medications can trigger complex sleep behaviors, sleepwalking, sleep driving, and in the rarest and most extreme documented cases, other complex actions performed while the patient's higher brain functions are not fully online. Patients in these states have been documented, in medical literature, performing actions they have no memory of afterward, with no ability to control or even perceive what they were doing in real time. This is the medical backdrop against which the events of March 8th unfolded. On that night, inside the family home, Slaughter's 6-year-old daughter did not survive. When first responders arrived, they were faced with a scene that immediately raised complicated questions. This was not a straightforward domestic homicide scene with an obvious motive. There was no history of conflict between mother and daughter that neighbors or family could point to. There was no note, no plan, nothing that suggested premeditation in the traditional sense. What investigators found instead was a mother in a state that responding officers described as disoriented and, by several accounts, genuinely unaware of the full scope of what had happened. That disconnect between the severity of the tragedy and the apparent state of the person responsible is what set this case on a completely different legal track than almost anything else on this list. Clark County prosecutors still had to bring charges. Regardless of the circumstances, a child had lost her life, and the legal system does not simply set aside a case because the explanation is complicated. Slaughter was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But almost immediately, her defense team began building a case not around denial, but around causation. They argued that the medication Slaughter had been taking had triggered a documented, medically recognized psychiatric break, one that stripped her of the conscious awareness and intent the law requires for a first-degree murder conviction. This wasn't a novel legal strategy invented for this case. Sleep medication-induced parasomnia defenses have appeared in courts across the country, though successful, fully accepted verdicts using them remain rare, and each case turns heavily on the specific medical evidence presented. What followed was years, not months, of pretrial proceedings. Forensic psychiatrists were brought in from both sides. The prosecution's experts examined Slaughter's medical history, her prescription records, dosage information, and any prior history of adverse reactions to the medication. The defense's experts built a case around the specific pharmacology of the drug, presenting research on how it interacts with certain individuals' neurochemistry, and how in the documented rare cases, patients have carried out complex actions with no memory of them afterward. A state fundamentally different from someone who is simply asleep, in the way we normally understand it, and fundamentally different from someone acting with conscious intent. Toxicology reports from the night of the incident became a critical piece of evidence, establishing what was actually in Slaughter's system at the time and at what concentration, compared to what was medically expected at a therapeutic dose versus what might indicate a more severe reaction. Pharmacological experts testified about half-lives, metabolization rates, and how individual variation in how people process medication can lead to wildly different effects from the same dose. The case dragged through Clark County's court system for years, a reflection of just how much expert testimony had to be gathered, cross-examined, and weighed. This wasn't a case that could be resolved with eyewitness testimony or a confession in the traditional sense. This was a case that lived and died on medical science, and medical science, particularly around the edges of rare psychiatric phenomena, rarely offers absolute certainty. Finally, in July of 2017, a Clark County jury reached its verdict. They did not acquit Danielle Slaughter, and they did not convict her under a standard first-degree murder verdict either. Instead, they returned a verdict specifically designed for cases exactly like this one: guilty but mentally ill of first-degree murder. It's worth pausing here, because this verdict tends to be misunderstood by the public. A guilty but mentally ill verdict is not the same as not guilty by reason of insanity. It is not an acquittal. It is a formal, legal acknowledgement by a jury that a crime occurred and that the defendant is responsible for it, while simultaneously and formally acknowledging that mental illness was a significant, documented factor in what happened. Practically, it means the defendant still serves the sentence associated with the underlying conviction, but with the mental illness formally on the record, something that can affect where and how a sentence is served, particularly around access to psychiatric treatment while incarcerated. For the jury, this verdict represented an attempt to hold two truths that don't often coexist comfortably in a courtroom: that a 6-year-old girl lost her life, and that the person responsible for that loss may not have been fully in command of her own actions in the moment it happened. Neither truth erases the other. The jury's verdict was, in essence, the legal system's most honest attempt to say both things out loud at once. This case had ripple effects well beyond the Las Vegas courtroom where it was decided. It became a frequently cited example in ongoing national conversations among physicians, pharmacologists, and patient safety advocates about how sedative hypnotic sleep medications are prescribed, monitored, and explained to patients. In the years following this case, increased attention was paid to patient counseling around these medications, making sure patients and their families understand the warning signs of an adverse reaction and the importance of reporting anything unusual to a prescribing physician immediately. It also became a case study in law schools and forensic psychiatry programs, precisely because it sits at such a difficult intersection of medicine and criminal law. How much can a jury be expected to weigh complex pharmacological testimony? How does the legal system fairly account for psychiatric states that are, by their nature, difficult to prove or disprove after the fact? These aren't questions with tidy answers, and this case remains one of the clearest illustrations of just how much strain that uncertainty puts on everyone involved: the jury, the attorneys, and above all, the families connected to it, who had to sit through years of proceedings before receiving any resolution at all. If this case brings up difficult feelings for you, or if you or someone you know is dealing with a mental health crisis, the National Alliance on Mental Illness operates a free, confidential helpline that connects people with real support and resources. These conversations matter, and reaching out for help early can make all the difference. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 8. Offenders: Erika Covington and Arionna Taylor. Date of crime: May 15, 2023. Court: Clark County, Nevada. There is a version of Las Vegas that most visitors never think about. The version where every hallway, elevator, casino floor, and hotel corridor is being watched by a network of cameras so dense that almost nothing happens without leaving a digital trail. Case 8 is a story about that other Las Vegas. It's a story about how, in a city built on spectacle, the very technology designed to protect guests became the evidence that would ultimately undo two women's plan. On the night of May 15, 2023, 25-year-old Brian Altamirano Solano was a guest at Caesar's Palace, one of the most recognizable resorts on the Strip. Like millions of visitors before him, he was simply there to enjoy the city. He had no way of knowing that from the moment he stepped onto the casino floor, he was being watched, not by security, but by two women who had already decided he was a target. Erika Covington and Arionna Taylor spent time studying Altamirano Solano before making a move. Investigators would later determine, through hours of pulled surveillance footage, that the two women tracked his movements deliberately, following him through public areas of the resort in a pattern that was anything but coincidental. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was methodical. Camera after camera captured them keeping him in sight, waiting for the moment he would be alone and vulnerable. And that moment came when he returned to his hotel room. What happened inside that room ended Altamirano Solano's life. Before leaving, the two women took his bag. They walked out of a resort that houses some of the most sophisticated surveillance infrastructure in the world, apparently believing they could disappear into the crowd of tens of thousands of other guests moving through the property that night. They were wrong. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police detectives, working with hotel security teams, began reconstructing the night almost immediately. Caesar's Palace, like most major Strip resorts, operates one of the most extensive private camera networks in the country, a system built originally to protect the casino floor from cheating, but which has, in case after case over the decades, become an unmatched tool for homicide investigators. Detectives were able to trace Covington and Taylor's movements from the moment they entered the property, through the casino floor, into elevator bays, and down the hallway to Altamirano Solano's room. The footage didn't just place them at the scene. It established intent, sequence, and a clear narrative of two people working together toward a plan. Once identified, both women were arrested and formally charged in Clark County with offenses tied to the killing and the robbery that followed it. Facing a body of surveillance evidence that left little room for a viable defense at trial, Covington and Taylor's legal teams began negotiating with prosecutors. Rather than risk the far harsher sentencing exposure that a first-degree murder conviction at trial could bring, both women accepted negotiated plea agreements. In January of 2025, both were formally sentenced to concurrent prison terms of 10 to 25 years each. The case moved from arrest to resolution far faster than many other cases on this list, a direct result of how overwhelming and specific the video evidence against them was. There was little ambiguity for a jury to weigh, and both the prosecution and the defense recognized that plainly. For the Strip's hospitality and security industry, this case reinforced something casino security teams already understood well. In a city built on cameras, very little goes unseen for long. For law enforcement, it became another example of how quickly modern surveillance networks can convert a seemingly anonymous crime into a fully reconstructed timeline. For Brian Altamirano Solano's family, it meant a resolution, however painful, arrived without the added burden of a prolonged trial. If you or someone you know has been affected by violent crime, the Nevada Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence and local victim advocacy centers offer confidential support and resources for families navigating the aftermath of loss. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 9. Offender, Kayla Alery. Date of crime, February 27, 2024. Court, Clark County, Nevada. Some cases on this list involve motive, money, revenge, jealousy, a plan years in the making. Case 9 involves none of that. It is, by every account gathered during the investigation, one of the most disturbing kinds of crime precisely because there was no relationship, no history, and no discernible reason connecting the person responsible to the victim at all. On February 27, 2024, 41-year-old Raul Cardoza was doing what he did most days. Working as a carpet cleaner, sitting in his work van, going about an ordinary afternoon. He had no connection to Kayla Alery. He didn't know her. There was no dispute, no prior interaction, nothing that investigators could ever identify linking the two of them in any way before that moment. Alery approached and fired on Cardoza as he sat in his vehicle, in what investigators would describe as a completely unprovoked attack. He did not survive. There was no robbery, no argument, no attempt to take anything from him. For homicide detectives, cases without an evident motive are often the hardest to close. Without a connection between victim and offender, there's no natural starting point for an investigation. Random violence doesn't leave the kind of trail that jealousy, debt, or a breakup does. What broke this case open wasn't a confession or a tip from someone who knew Alery. It was chance, the kind of chance that has become increasingly common in the era of ubiquitous personal dash cameras. A nearby rideshare driver, working a normal shift, happened to have a dash cam running at the exact moment the attack occurred. The entire event was captured on video. Unedited, unambiguous, real-time footage of exactly what happened and who was responsible. That footage transformed what could have been an unsolved, motiveless cold case into a rapid identification and arrest. Detectives were able to identify Alery, build a case grounded in direct video evidence, and move forward with charges without having to rely on circumstantial reconstruction or witness memory, which can fade or conflict over time. As the case moved through Clark County's court system, questions emerged about Alery's mental state at the time of the shooting. The complete absence of any conventional motive, no relationship, no dispute, no material gain, pointed toward the possibility that a mental health crisis, rather than a rational decision-making process, was behind the attack. Evaluations were conducted, and ultimately, in August of 2025, Alery entered a plea of guilty, but mentally ill to second-degree murder. She was formally sentenced to a term of 10 years to life. This case became a widely discussed example of how modern personal recording technology, dash cams, doorbell cameras, phone footage, has fundamentally changed how quickly random, motiveless violent crimes can be solved. A generation ago, a case with no connection between victim and offender and no witnesses might have gone unsolved for years, or never been solved at all. Today, the sheer density of recording devices moving through public spaces has become one of law enforcement's most valuable, unplanned investigative tools. It also reinforced why mental health crisis intervention remains such an urgent public safety priority. Cases without a rational motive are often, upon closer examination, cases where someone was experiencing a serious, untreated psychiatric crisis. Communities and families are encouraged to take sudden, significant changes in behavior seriously, and to seek help through crisis intervention resources before a situation becomes irreversible. If you or someone you know is showing signs of a mental health crisis, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available around the clock and can help connect people with immediate support. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 10. Offender, Devyn Michaels. Date of crime, August 6, 2023. Court, Clark County, Nevada, Las Vegas. Case 10 closes out this list with one of the most closely watched trials in recent Nevada history. A case that drew significant media attention not just because of the severity of what happened, but because of the very public reversal that took place partway through the legal process. Devyn Michaels, a former adult film actress, was connected to Jonathan Willett, her former partner. On August 6, 2023, inside a residence in Henderson, Willett lost his life in an attack that investigators described as severe, and that would ultimately require an extensive forensic reconstruction to fully understand. Crime scene investigators faced a complex scene, and the case quickly became one of the most serious homicide investigations Henderson police had handled in years. Michaels was identified and arrested in connection with Willett's death, and the case moved into Nevada's court system. For a period, it appeared the case might resolve through a negotiated plea agreement, a common path in serious felony cases where both sides recognize the strength or weakness of the evidence and choose to avoid the uncertainty of a jury trial. But partway through the process, Michaels withdrew from that agreement, a decision that sent the case to a full jury trial instead. What followed was a trial that laid out, in detail, the forensic and circumstantial evidence connecting Michaels to the killing. Prosecutors presented physical evidence recovered from the scene, forensic pathology findings establishing the cause and manner of death, and a timeline of events built from digital records, witness accounts, and crime scene analysis. The defense contested key elements of the state's case, but after weighing the full body of evidence presented, a Las Vegas jury returned a verdict convicting Devyn Michaels of first-degree murder with a deadly weapon. Sentencing did not come immediately. It took time for the court to move through the required proceedings, and it wasn't until January of 2026 that Michaels was formally sentenced. She received a term of 28 years to life in prison, a sentence that reflected both the severity of the offense and the use of a deadly weapon as an aggravating factor under Nevada law. This case drew unusual public attention in part because of Michaels' background, but for the detectives, prosecutors, and forensic teams involved, it was handled the same way any serious homicide case is handled, methodically, evidence first, with the goal of ensuring the legal process reached a result that could withstand appeal and scrutiny. The decision to withdraw a plea and proceed to trial added years to the timeline, but it also meant that the eventual conviction came from a full public trial and a unanimous jury verdict, rather than a negotiated resolution, a distinction that matters both legally and for a victim's family seeking a definitive, public accounting of what happened. For Jonathan Willett's family and loved ones, the sentencing in January of 2026 closed a chapter that had opened more than 2 years earlier, on a single night in Henderson that changed all of their lives permanently. If this case has affected you, victim support services are available through the Nevada Attorney General's Office of Victim Services, offering resources and guidance for families navigating the long legal road that follows a violent loss. Don't forget to like and subscribe. 10 cases. 10 very different women. 10 families across Nevada who woke up one morning with no idea that their lives were about to change forever. What makes this list so difficult to sit with isn't just the outcomes. It's how different every single path to that outcome was. Some of these cases were carefully planned, built around money or resentment that had been simmering for years. Others happened in an instant, with no warning and, in some cases, no clear motive at all. Some of the women on this list have spent decades maintaining their innocence, and in at least one case, the legal system itself eventually agreed, vacating a conviction decades after it was handed down. Others confessed, pleaded guilty, or were convicted after years of forensic and psychiatric testimony that tried to answer questions science still doesn't have perfect answers for. If there's one thread that connects all 10 of these cases, it's this. The Nevada justice system, for all its imperfections and all the years some of these cases took to resolve, was built to keep asking questions until it found the most accurate answer it could, even when that answer was complicated, even when it took decades, and even when it meant admitting a mistake had been made. Behind every one of these cases is a victim who deserves to be remembered as more than a headline. Nguyen, Ronald Rudin, Jade Morris, Nathan Paet, the 6 lives lost in Reno in 1980. Leroy Pelton, a 6-year-old girl whose name we've chosen to protect out of respect for her family. Brian Altamirano Solano, Raul Cardoza, Jonathan Willett. These were real people, with families who are still living with what happened long after the cameras and courtrooms moved on. If any part of this documentary affected you, please know that support exists. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available around the clock for anyone in crisis. The National Alliance on Mental Illness offers a free, confidential helpline for individuals and families navigating mental health challenges. And the Nevada Attorney General's Office of Victim Services provides resources for families rebuilding their lives after violent loss. These cases are hard to hear, but the people behind them are the reason we tell these stories with care, not sensationalism. That's 10 cases from Nevada's court records. Cases we'll continue to revisit, update, and follow as new legal developments come in, because as several of these stories show, the story isn't always over when the sentence is handed down. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with us. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before you go, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another documentary like this one. If this episode moved you, let us know in the comments which case stayed with you the most, and don't forget to hit like. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you carefully researched, respectful true crime coverage. We'll see you in the next one.